about that. If it shuts off, who knows? Are you good? All right. Hi. Whoa, that's kind of loud. How y'all doing? Good? Good. Thanks for coming. I have Nathan here from Chattanooga, Tennessee. How you doing, Nathan?
Good,
man.
Good. Excited to be here.
You're good. That's awesome. Thanks for coming. Thanks for the cold. Everybody says I brought it with me. Texas is hot. I refer to it as a dusty oven. So, anyways, that was really weird. All right. So I told my son I'd tell a joke. All right. So what do you call a cow with no legs?
Ground beef.
Oh, that's right, ground beef. That's funny. Anyways, that was good. It's a crossover. All right, thanks for coming. I'm going to turn it over to Nathan because I'm super uncomfortable. And here you go.
All right. Yeah. Get flipped in here. How are y'all doing this evening? I have to try not to say y'all. I'm used to saying y'all. How are y'all doing this evening?
Good.
I'm from Indiana. I grew up in Japan. I've lived in Georgia and Tennessee and Washington, so all the accents kind of mixed together. But my name is Nathan Holritz. I do own Photographer's Edit, and to be clear, this is not going to be a Photographer's Edit commercial. It's actually funny, I was in Oklahoma last night teaching a workshop there, and it turns out that one of the members of this particular photography group there outside of Oklahoma City had started a rumor in their Facebook group that I was just coming to promote Photographer's Edit, so there's no reason to go. I do own Photographer's Edit. We handle post-production for wedding and portrait photographers, and that is what I do full-time. I did shoot weddings for 10, almost 11 years, transitioned into running a post-production company, but this evening is not about Photographer's Edit. I surely hope that you will at least consider the possibility that outsourcing your post-production, whether you're a portrait or wedding photographer, can add significant value, not only to your business, but to your personal life. I can certainly speak to that later on if you all have questions about it. But this evening we are going to be talking about Lightroom workflow. The question would be why? Why would an owner of a wedding or a post-production company that handles post-production for professional photographers, why would he be teaching the very thing that he's hoping photographers will send him? And the reality is, and the answer to that big why question for me ultimately lies in, well, what you can see here are my two kids. We set up a little mini portrait session. It's been probably a month and a half, 2 months ago, just in my apartment. Some studio lights, and these were kind of the outtakes, if you will, from that particular session. But my kids are 14 and 10. Austin is 14. My daughter Addison is 10, and they are my why. When I was a wedding photographer shooting 30, even as many as 40 weddings a year, post-production was taking up a lot of my time. Long story short, I started Photographer's Edit because I needed a solution to the problem. But ultimately, what I really needed was time. I needed time with my kids, and ultimately I needed time to live my life. And sitting behind a computer 24/7 processing images wasn't going to allow me time to do any of that. So I started a post-production company. It's given me time. It's also now giving thousands of photographers their lives back. And what I was sharing with one of our photographers here this evening earlier is that if I don't have the opportunity, my company doesn't have the opportunity to handle post-production for you, the least that I can do is share with you how to process efficiently in Lightroom. The workflow that I'm going to teach you this evening is the very workflow that I actually taught my post-production team. We've got about 80 editors that are handling post-production for Photographer's Edit now. We processed millions of images this past year, and hoping to do millions more this year. But this is the very workflow that we started with, and I'm going to share it with you. And what you're going to get from it this evening is not so much about fancy details. It's funny actually when you dive into Photoshop or you even dive into Lightroom, it's easy to spend hours and hours and hours learning the ins and outs of the software. The reality is you're probably only going to use about 20% of that, if that much, to get the majority of the work done, right? The 80-20 principle. So what I want to teach you this evening is the 20% that you need to accomplish at least 80%, and I would venture to say 90-95% of the work that you need to get done as a portrait or wedding photographer, or maybe a commercial photographer. I'm going to teach you how to do that efficiently. And ultimately, it's not about, again, fancy technique, it's about system. Now, if you look up system, I think this is from the dictionary on my computer, my Mac here. It says a set of principles or procedures according to which something is done, an organized scheme or method. That sounds a bit uptight. So we're going to keep it really, really simple. Let's just go with something like this. How about an organized way of getting things done every time? And that's the important piece, right? Doing it, well, there's two pieces to that, really. First of all, you start with the organization, and then you jump to actually doing that consistently. Most photographers, when they jump into post-production, sorry, hiding behind the post there. Most photographers, when they jump into post-production, do it or approach it in a very haphazard manner, right? They open the images, bring them into Lightroom, they start playing with whatever the latest Lightroom preset is that they downloaded, and applying this one and applying that one. Oh, that looks really cool, and oh, that image is terrible, I'm going to delete that, and this slight adjustment here. And before you know it, the average photographer, wedding photographer, I'm pretty certain is spending a good 12 to 16 hours per wedding, and in many cases much more than that, processing just one wedding. And if you're shooting part-time and particularly full-time, that is a lot of time that you're wasting as a result of a lack of system or systems in place. So what I'm going to teach you this evening, and what's really important to keep in mind, is the system that I'm going to teach you. And I think I'm going to be able to save you a pretty significant amount of time if you're willing to be open to implementing what is ultimately a very simple system consistently. And that's the key, is the consistency in that. Before we actually jump into Lightroom, and how many of you currently use Lightroom? Most of you. How many of you are using Lightroom Creative Cloud, or version 6? A few of you. How many, version 5? 4? A few of you, okay. If you're not using Creative Cloud, it's the best $10 a month that you're going to spend. You spend that much in coffee probably every 2 days. So apply that to Lightroom, and actually get Lightroom and Photoshop through Adobe Creative Cloud. $10 a month. You have the latest version of each of those pieces of software. And the workflow that I'm going to teach you this evening is largely applicable across the board from version 4 on up. But certainly you're going to have the best and the latest feature set and processing power if you have Adobe Creative Cloud. So if you haven't downloaded it, just do a quick Google search. You'll be able to pull it up. It's $10 a month. Highly recommend that you get signed up for that. Before we dive into Lightroom, I wanted to speak very briefly about file organization. Now, what I'm sharing with you again this evening is, first of all, a system, or a couple of systems. We're going to talk about file organization and management. But then secondly, we're going to dive into the system of Lightroom processing. Processing in Lightroom becomes a lot simpler if you don't have to go searching for files for minutes or even hours on end, right? Diving through hard drives and trying to pull up this folder and that folder, trying to find this particular order or this particular job. If you've got a simple system to manage your files and folders, then you're going to be able to save an incredible amount of time. So let's just speak very quickly about file organization. Grab a little bit of water. And I know that you can go take classes at WPPI or at imaging, digital asset management courses. Even that name sounds extremely fancy and maybe a bit uptight. We're not going to make it overly complicated. There's really no need to. With the search functionality that we have on our Macs and PCs, it's very easy if we name the files and folders simply and appropriately to find what we need to. And if we've got a good organizational system in place, it makes it that much easier. So what I'm going to recommend to you, first of all, is actually having all of your client orders or client shoots on an external hard drive. Now, to some of you, that may be a given. You may already be doing that. A lot of photographers don't. They go shoot, they bring those files home, they dump them on their desktop or on their laptop, and then they stay there. They may shift that folder to a different place, but all of these raw files, in many cases, are staying on that hard drive for an extended amount of time. Before the photographer realizes it, that hard drive is mostly filled up, and it's actually slowing their computer down. So not only are they having to waste time looking for the files because they don't know where they put them, but it's also slowing their computer down, so processing takes even longer. So what I recommend to you is, once you shoot that session or shoot that event, bring those files home, dump them onto your computer, certainly create a backup, but then put the files on an external, what I would call a working external drive to begin with. Now I mentioned the offsite backup. What I would also suggest to you is to create a mirror of this external drive that you can put in an offsite location. Now when I was shooting actively, I went to the extreme. I actually put my offsite backups in a bank vault. So about once a month, month and a half, 2 months, I would go get that external drive, I'd bring it back, I'd offload the JPEGs, the final processed images, to the external drive that went back into the bank vault. You don't have to go to that extreme. Find a friend's home or a family member's home that you can take those files and leave them at, just so you've got an offsite backup. Of course, now with the online galleries that we've had for so long, that also acts as an external backup, which is great. But use a working external drive. Memory's cheap now. Spend $100, go get a terabyte drive, 2 terabyte drive, and work off of that. When you actually do the processing of the images themselves, it doesn't hurt to then move that folder to your desktop, because if your computer's not having to access that external drive, it will work a little bit more quickly. But for the majority of those files, keep them on an external drive. It'll save you time, space, and ultimately help keep everything a lot more organized. Folder structure, very simply, and I'm going to show you this here on my computer when we get into the processing itself, but very simply, we're going to start with, on that external hard drive, the year. So we're in 2016. And again, this is very, very simple, but that's the point. They can be really simple and ultimately easy. Start with the folder that has the year on it, so 2016. Within that folder then, if you want to create additional subcategories, you can. I don't think it's necessary. Within that year folder, you're then going to use the client's last name for the folder of, for the client that you're photographing. You've got on that folder the client's last name and the type of shoot. And I'll show you what this looks like here in just a second. But it might be Smith Portrait. And if you have multiple clients with the same last name, add a date to the end of that. Create additional separation and organization. And then within that folder, you're going to have 3 additional folders. Originals, which will be the raw files if you're shooting raw, or JPEGs if you do that. And then the edited files, those JPEGs that you're going to export. And then the Lightroom catalog. We'll talk about Lightroom catalogs a little bit more toward the end of the workflow. Any questions about that? So that's a simple organization method. Now, you might say, well, that's a given, isn't it? You'd be surprised at probably the number of photographers in here. If you go home and look at their desktop or their laptop screen, the number of files and folders that are just kind of strewn all over the place. And if you ask them to go find this particular shoot or that particular shoot, it's going to take them 15, 20 minutes to do that. And what you have to keep in mind is if you're shooting 20, 30, 40 weddings a year, maybe 50 portrait sessions a year, you have to figure the amount of time that you're wasting per session, right? If you're spending X number of hours processing, or you're spending X number of minutes or hours looking for files, keeping track of everything, that's a lot of time. And if you're not considering the fact that your time is money as a business owner, that's a whole different conversation we can have a different day, but you absolutely need to be doing that. Every one of you needs to know, if I were to say, what are you worth an hour? Or what are you paying yourself an hour? You need to understand how much you're worth an hour and then translate that. And that's why outsourcing post-production, whether it's to a company like mine or even having an in-house editor, it means that you're saving time and ultimately giving yourself the opportunity to be able to build your business and ideally spend time with those that matter to you. So keep those things in mind. It's a very simple organizational system. I'll just show you the actual visual here. As I mentioned, and we'll just treat this as though it's an external drive. I've just given it a very simple name. We are in 2016, so I'll update that there. But as I said, the year, and then very simply the client's last name and the type of shoot. Within that, we'll have the originals folder, and then once we process the images later, of course, we'll have those 2 other folders, and we'll talk about that later on. Any questions about that? Pretty straightforward, right? This is simple stuff. And again, the key here is the system. It's not so much that I'm going to teach you a fancy technique. It's about a system, learning a system and then following that consistently. All right, so let's jump into the workflow itself. And very simply, we're going to just drag and drop this folder of images to the Lightroom icon. And I've got my Lightroom software set up so that by default, it opens, before it even opens the software completely, it gives me this dialog box. It allows me to be able to create a fresh Lightroom catalog. Now there are mixed opinions on whether or not you have one massive catalog that houses every shoot, or maybe you're separating it into segments, type of shoot, portraits, weddings, etc. Maybe you separate it by year. What I'm going to recommend to you for the sake of simplicity this evening, and it's certainly what I recommend to all of our clients at Photographers Edit, is that you create an individual catalog for each shoot. Now the only disadvantage to doing it this way is, well, I guess there are two ultimately if we want to nitpick, but one is that you can't keyword the session or the event. For example, if you're a wedding photographer and you want to keyword all the images associated with the Cheney place. You shot a wedding here at the Cheney place, you want to generate some sample images to send Ben and Mindy, then you might tag all the images associated with that particular location and very easily be able to pull all those images from across all the weddings up within that one catalog. That's really powerful. The other, of course, the advantage to it is the fact that you can simply scroll through that catalog and look at all the shoots that you've processed within that catalog. The drawback to it is that there are potential technical issues over time. If you've got hundreds or even thousands of sessions or events within that one catalog, there's a potential for corruption or at least slowing that catalog down. And the other disadvantage is if you are sharing that catalog either with a third-party post-production company or maybe an in-house editor, or you even want to move that catalog and take it with you on the road to process, there's also a chance that there can be some corruption in that process as well. Or not necessarily corruption, but confusion between the catalog and connecting the images, the original images, to the catalog. A lot less potential for issue if you do have an individual catalog for each session. And so that's what I'm going to recommend, because I want to keep it simple for you and easy for you. Go ahead and create an individual catalog for each session. So we're going to do that here. You see the option, and I'll show you here in just a second how, if your software is not set up to open up this dialog box, how you can do that. But we're going to create a new catalog, and we'll go to the desktop here. Of course, we're going to put it right in this client folder. And we'll just call it very simply Smith Catalog. And we click Create. You can see it drops that folder in the client folder, and it opens up the import dialog box here. And I don't think, well, maybe it will. Open up the preferences here, and I'll show you really quickly. In Lightroom Preferences, under the General tab, there's this option right here that says Default Catalog. And that drop down, I just have set to prompt me when starting Lightroom. So if you don't have that set up that way, that's how you can tell the software to open up that dialog box each time you open the software. And whether you're creating a new catalog or you simply want to be able to go to a particular catalog, that dialog box will allow you to do that more efficiently. All right, so there are 4 steps to the workflow that I'm going to share with you this evening. Again, very, very simple. This is very easy to do. And the first step is the import process, and you might say, well, that's a given. And certainly it is, but more specifically, importing with a developed preset or Lightroom preset. Now, the reason this matters is actually there are multiple reasons, really. First of all, as I mentioned earlier, and as you probably well know yourself, photographers tend to waste a lot of time playing with Lightroom presets after they've imported the images in the Lightroom. What we're trying to avoid is wasting any time, so we want to apply our favorite preset to the images on import. And not just a favorite preset, but this is a preset ideally that you may have purchased it and modified it, or maybe you created it yourself. That allows you to, if the images have been photographed well in camera, go ahead and export to JPEG once that preset's been applied. That's the goal. We want a preset that's going to slightly enhance the images. Of course, raw images are a bit flat by nature. So this image is going to slightly increase the contrast, maybe adjust the color profile, add a little bit of sharpening, maybe make 1 or 2 other adjustments, and it's ready to ideally export that image to JPEG once you've imported it. It could be just that simple. Now, it takes some time to develop a preset that works well across a variety of lighting scenarios, indoor, outdoor, because of course, varying contrasts. I've spent hours and hours developing the preset that we use as kind of our default processing preset at Photographers Edit. I've spent hours developing that over the years, not because it's a complicated preset in its feature set, but because it has to work well across a variety of scenarios. So you have to take a little bit of time testing the preset on various images, maybe even if you shoot with more than one photographer that has a different camera, bring some of those files in, test them across a variety of scenarios, a variety of cameras, and make sure that that preset works consistently across the board. It's not going to be perfect, but it works consistently across the board, and that's the preset that you want to be using. And that's the most efficient way to use Lightroom presets. Using a preset to make an adjustment to the contrast or to the levels, the brightness, or these types of things, really not necessary, as I'm going to show you here in just a little bit. There are a lot quicker ways to do that. And playing with presets for the fun of it, no question it's fun. Designate a time to do that, but when you're diving into actually processing your images, you want to get through them as quickly as possible. The most efficient way to do it is to apply that preset on import. One way that I describe it to our clients is that you're applying a baseline finish to your images. This is the so-called look that you're applying to your images. A lot of photographers get carried away with saying that they want their style applied to the images, and all they're referring to is a preset. A preset is not your style. That may reflect the look that you're going for in your images, but there are 10,000 other photographers out there using the same preset. It's not your style. But this may be a particular finish, whether you like to use a film preset or something comparable. You want a particular finish to your images, so you're applying that as a baseline. If you photograph the images, ideally you can just go ahead and export them to JPEG from there. If not, you're then making slight adjustments before exporting them to JPEG. That's the idea. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. So we are going to apply that preset here on import, and that is the key factor in this. And believe it or not, that simple step, and it does take a little bit of work up front, finding or developing the right preset, but that simple step will save you 20, 30% of your workflow time. If you take out using presets later on, you can save a significant amount of time just with that one step. I will mention, side note, the only drawback really that I can think of to using Lightroom is the time that it takes to build previews with raw files. It takes an incredible amount of time to import images into Lightroom. A lot of photographers use Photo Mechanic to cull their images before they process in Lightroom or before they send the images to us. There is a couple of different ways that you can handle that. You can import right here where it says build previews. You can import with minimal previews. That will create a faster import process. The drawback to that is later on you have to give the image a bit to build a preview before you can actually process it. You'll see that happen here in just a second. I am going to import on the minimal setting for the sake of time this evening, but if you have time to start the import process and then go grab coffee or have lunch or whatever the case may be, and go ahead and import it standard or even one-for-one preview, because what that will do is go ahead and build the previews for you so that when you actually dive into processing later on, it goes a lot more smoothly and ultimately a lot more quickly. So that's the goal. I'm going to go ahead and choose the option here to build smart previews, and we can talk about smart previews later on. I won't dive into that during this step, but I'm going to choose that option here. We talked about the develop setting. That's the Lightroom preset. You're going to apply the appropriate one. I'm going to apply a color preset to all my images. The few that I may convert to black and white later on, I'll show you how I go about that process. If you do want to apply metadata to your images, you can do that here, and it's very easy to create a preset. I'm not going to dive into this evening. It's pretty straightforward, self-explanatory, but you can create a preset for your metadata, and then of course add keywords as appropriate. Again, if you're just creating a new catalog for each shoot, there's really no need at this point to add keywords. Keep it simple. So we're going to click import here, and that is the first step. Simple, right? Easy. Yes?
So whenever they say maybe this is not fine, but like when you say metadata, is that like stuff that when you upload it onto your website, will those keywords be searchable like SEO, or is that mostly just searchable for Lightroom?
That is, and then you also have the innate metadata for copyright information associated with your brand as well.
So if I wanted, for example, to put something on my blog and I selected some images and I wanted to export them and put metadata in them, so
Yes.
they'd be searchable, like to say it all at once, that would be a good.
You can apply that information, and then I think there's also an option in the export dialog box that will allow you to do the same thing right here. So you can do the same thing on export. My recommendation would be to create that preset and import it with that preset, and then you don't have to worry about it later on. Yeah, of course. Any other questions about the first step? Or about presets, how presets work? No? Good. It's simple. Seriously, trust me, give it a shot. That will save you an extreme amount of time. Just that first step will save you an extreme amount of time in your processing. Apply that preset up front. Again, take the time to find the right one or develop the right one, but it will save you an incredible amount of time. So the first step is to import with the Lightroom preset or develop preset. You can see that it's currently building smart previews and importing these images here, but we're going to go ahead and begin the culling process. Now, Something to keep in mind as we're going through this evening, I'm going to be using keyboard shortcuts. Probably 85, 90% of the workflow will be handled using keyboard keys or keyboard shortcuts. There is a reason for that. You have to think about the fact that a portrait session, you may shoot 200, 300 images. A wedding, you may be into the thousands. If you are dragging your mouse around the screen, clicking on individual images, clicking on settings, going up to the menu, and doing this over and over and over again, shoot after shoot after shoot, the amount of time that you waste, it may be seconds individually, that adds up to an incredible amount of time actually over a long season. We're trying to design a system here, a workflow that's extremely efficient. So my recommendation to you is that you use keyboard shortcuts. Now, I'm going to call out the keyboard shortcuts that I'm using this evening, but I will follow up with you all. You'll get an email after this, here in the next couple of days or so, with a downloadable or a link to a downloadable PDF. You can actually download the PDF, very specific, not an all-inclusive keyboard shortcut unless for Lightroom, because that's really not necessary. But specifically the keyboard shortcuts that we're using for this workflow this evening, I'll send you a link to a downloadable PDF that you can reference for future. But I will be using keyboard shortcuts for 85–90% of the workflow this evening. If you are on a Windows computer, you're simply going to substitute Command for the key Control. And keep that in mind if you are on a Windows computer. All right, so I'm going to get rid of the tabs across the top, bottom, sides. Tab Shift is the keyboard shortcut for that, so that we can look at the thumbnails here. Now I do have a nice 24-inch LaCie monitor at home, but this is a little 13-inch monitor, and you may be used to processing on your laptop. If that's the case, you need to be able to figure out how to efficiently look at the images large enough so that you can go through the culling process. By the way, I do say cull. A lot of photographers say edit when they're talking about getting rid of images. That gets confusing because that could also mean processing, and it could mean a number of things. So I'm going to say cull, and what we mean by that is getting rid of, we can look at it one of two ways, getting rid of the so-called bad images, or the way that I like to look at it, and I think the more efficient way to go about it is to pick the good images. I think photographers kind of get caught up, there's a psychological block, a mental block, when they think about deleting images, right? Those are your babies, that's your artwork. You don't want to delete anything, and oh, what if I missed something, and what if I delete a good one? You can waste a lot of time taking that approach. My suggestion to you is that you focus on picking the good images. And I'll show you how specifically we go about that in just a second. Plus and minus keys, increase or decrease the thumbnail size, very simple. And of course you're going to move around with the arrow keys. And then if I want to look at a series, and ideally my suggestion to you is if you're doing a portrait session or a wedding for that matter, and as much as you can, keep a series of images to 4 or 5, maybe 5 or 6 at the most. But keep it to 4 or 5 because certainly that's going to make your job easier later on, less images to cull through. It also makes looking through the images in that culling process a lot easier. So I can pull up 5 images here. I'm going to hold down the Shift key and move over with the arrow key. So just Shift to move over with the arrow to multi-select the images. And in this case, I'm just going to click on the letter N. Now don't ask me why the letter N represents the survey view or survey mode, but that's the view that we're going into here. And now we can look at these images in a little bit larger format. It's a lot easier to cull these images or choose the images we're going to give to the clients. 2 notes. What you are seeing on the screen there in no way reflects the color or the dynamic range that I'm seeing on my screen. So keep that in mind. Don't pay attention to the screen for the sake of color accuracy this evening. This is more about the workflow. The other thing to keep in mind too, and this is an expectation that was created for the clients that I worked with, and I shot a range, or worked with a range of clients. My first wedding I photographed back in the film days for $300. I lost money just because the development of the 12 rolls or so of film was so expensive. But $300 on up to $10,000 or more. I've worked with a range of clients, so this is not specific to a particular client type. This is an expectation that you create for your clients, and that is that the images that you're processing initially are proof images. Why is that important? I talked to a photographer not too long ago who is, first of all, an absolutely just incredibly talented photographer, and her processing is mind-blowing. It's absolutely stunning, stunning work. I'd love to hire her for my company. But she is spending as much as a month to a month and a half, in some cases maybe more, processing one wedding. Because she's treating each, and this is of course an extreme case, but she's treating each individual image almost like you would an individual print or an image for an album. My suggestion to you, for the sake of time management, is that you create the expectation for your clients that these images are proof images. Now, you don't have to downplay your work, and you're certainly not compromising. What you can explain to them is that the images that they get in their online gallery, or however you deliver your proofs to them, those images, if they order a large print from them, or if they order an album and those images are going to go into the album, they'll be retouched at that point. Create that expectation. That way you're not creating extra work for yourself up front and spending way too much time processing through what are ultimately proof images. So when you see something like a leaf on the ground, like you see right there, or the marks on the wall, these are things that, yeah, if they're going to order a 16 by 20, 20 by 30, 30 by 40, or the images are going to go into an album, certainly they'll get retouched as necessary. But for proof images, I'm simply giving them a preview of what can be. And that is an expectation that's important to create for your clients for the sake of your sanity, and again, for your time, which is ultimately the value that you have, or a large portion of the value that you have in your business. So keep that in mind. So we're going to move through these images. We're in the survey view here. I mentioned the letter N to get us to this view. By the way, this is the library module, or the grid view. I clicked on G to get back to the grid view. We're clicking on N to get to the survey mode, or survey view. And just like in the library mode, we can move around these images using arrow keys. And once we get to an image that we like, that we want to give to that client, keep to give to the client later on, I'm going to choose that image using the P key. P to pick, very simple. And you'll notice when I click on the P key, it throws a little flag down there in the bottom left-hand corner. I can get rid of that by clicking U to undo it, or P again to flag it as a pick. And remember, we're not deleting images, we're simply picking the images that we want to give to the client. And really the simplest way to do that is just glance at the series. If there's one or two that jump out at you, grab those and move on. Taking the time to zoom in on each one and overanalyzing it, really no need. The client's not sitting over your shoulder. It's easy to forget that sometimes, I think. And I think a lot of photographers get caught up in trying to process the images for other photographers that might look at their blog or Facebook or otherwise. This is about the client in the end. And you guys are wasting a lot of money if you're worried about impressing another photographer. So pick that image or two images that jumps out at you and move on to the next step. We're just going to grab a couple here. For those of you who do convert images to black and white when you're processing your images, what I suggest to you, and certainly in our workflow, give a 5-star, in my workflow I give a 5-star rating to my images, and I just do that with the number 5 key. So the images that I'm going to give to the client, the P key to flag it, and then if any of those images I'm going to convert to black and white later on, I'm going to give it a 5-star rating. Now, you could give it a color flag rating or any number of star ratings if you wanted to. For me, I can rest my index finger on the P key, my P key on the number 5 key, and just keep my hand there and work very quickly that way. My right hand is on the arrows, so I'm working off my keyboard, and it goes really, really quickly that way. So P to pick, 5-star rating, number 5 key to convert to black and white later on. All right, let's start moving a little bit more quickly now. By the way, the / key allows me to deselect images. I'm going to pull up the next series. Oops, we want to undo that. By the way, if you ever do something that you want to undo, Command Z. Many of you may know that, but Command Z will undo. I actually talked to a photographer after I did a workshop one time, and she had processed a whole wedding and got to the very end, hundreds, probably thousands of images actually. Got to the very end, I think accidentally applied a preset that totally made the whole session go awry, or the whole wedding go awry, and didn't realize that she could undo it. And went back and reprocessed the whole wedding. I could complete this workflow this evening, and I could literally take you back step by step just by hitting Command Z to undo. Or of course, with individual images in the develop module, as you'll see here, I'll show you really quickly, but you've got your history over here on the left-hand side, so you can go back through the history of the processing of individual images there. All right, so let's jump back to the survey view, the letter N. I can just glance through these very quickly, pick one or two, and move on. By the way, just because images exist doesn't mean you have to keep them, right? We want to give the client the best of the best. When I look at these images here, they're okay, but the expressions aren't ideal. The pose is a little bit awkward. I kind of like this here, but his eyes are kind of halfway closed. So I'm not actually going to pick any of these images. Again, just because they exist doesn't mean that you have to actually give them to your client. Make sure you're giving the best of the best. And a lot of photographers are giving high numbers of images to their client with the thought process that more is better. And I don't think that's really the case. I don't know how many of you are married or maybe had an event photographed for you, but scrolling through 800, 1,000, 1,200, 1,500 images, that's a lot of images to look through and pick 100 for an album, for example, or even just to look through it all. So give the best of the best to your client, whether it's a portrait session or an event, and you're going to be doing yourself a favor, but you're still going to be doing them a favor as well. It's going to reflect your brand much better. So let's pull up the next series. Another 4 here. Love that rawing motion, so I'm going to grab that. I don't want to convert any of these to black and white because the color is so wonderfully rich. I wish you could see that on the screen there, but we'll keep a couple of those. Jump to the next series. We've got a vertical format here. Keep one of those. No need to do too many. A little bit of an awkward kiss, so I'm just going to leave those alone. Next in this series, you can see, now if I wasn't talking, this could be going even faster, but very quickly glance in. I love how he's pulling her in to him there, so I'm just going to grab that one. And by the way, it is crooked, yes, but we're not doing any processing right now. It's important to keep the steps in your workflow separate for the sake of efficiency. If I got distracted and started processing here, what would happen? Well, then I'd start processing the next image, and then I go back and, oh, I don't like that really, and I'd start processing that image, and then I'm lost in the haphazard post-production process. So we want to keep the appropriate or the similar tasks grouped together. Right now we're not processing. We're simply focused on culling and picking a few images to convert to black and white. I like the lines in this image, and I think black and white does really well with interesting lines, so I'm going to convert that. Jump to the next in the series. Really quickly, I like the hand in the back of his head, so I'm going to keep that. Deselect. A couple more in this series where she's leaning into them there, more intimate, so I'll keep that. This is an attempt at doing something kind of creative. It's okay. We'll probably crop later, but I do like that expression, the interaction between the two of them shooting through that gate, so we'll keep one of those. But it's doing nothing in color, so I'm going to convert it to black and white. And I realize a lot of this is preferential, that's fine. You're going to get the idea of the workflow from it, though. That's what's important. Now here you see a long series of images. This is a little bit of overshooting, but we'll pull a couple of images from this, like that almost kiss right there. Actually, well, branches and I don't know if you would even call small trees like this tree trunks, but they're framing the couple pretty nicely there. So we'll keep that. Next in the series, really quickly, leaning into him, love that there. We'll keep that. Next in the series, not too similar, so we're going to ignore those. And it looks like we've got a few more here. Love that again with her hand in the back of his head, so we'll keep that there and move on. Not a huge fan of that composition, so we're going to leave those out. You can see how fast this goes, right? You glance at it, if you don't like it, don't keep it. If you like it, pick one or two and go on. This pose is a bit awkward, so I'm going to leave that alone.
But you're not deleting the ones you don't want.
That is correct, yeah, it's a great point. You'll notice there's no deleting happening, and I'm going to show you here the really powerful filtering system that's built into Lightroom in just a second. But memory is cheap, so that extra step or the extra work that it takes to actually delete files, don't waste your time with it. Simply focus on picking one or two images in a series and doing that through the whole session or the whole event, and you're going to save a lot of time that way. I like the eye contact with the camera there, so I'm going to pick that, and the slight tilt, it's a little bit different. keep that. And we'll stop there. All right. So this is, let's see, I think maybe 82 photos. Multiply that times 2 or 3. If I wasn't talking, it might take me between probably 5 minutes or so to actually cull the whole session with this approach. Now, I understand that it may take a little bit of practice to get to a point where you can move through your images that quickly. I realize it's subjective. I realize they're your baby, they're your artwork, and you're very protective. You want to make sure you give the client the best, but don't overcomplicate it. You're going to save a lot of time if you can just focus on this very simple methodology here. Now, this second step, the culling, actually has a second part, if you will. The culling and conversion to black and white. We're kind of grouping it into one step. We did rate a few images to convert to black and white later on. So what I want to do here is activate the filter bar, Command L. I mentioned the filtering earlier. Command L or Control L if you're on a Windows computer. You notice it activates the attribute filter here, or attribute filter menu or bar, and I'm going to click on the flag. First of all, to filter for flagged images. So we've gotten rid of all the images we're not going to give to the client. We're just looking at the images we want to give to the client. And then the additional filter for where those images were going to convert to black and white, I'm going to click on the 5th star. And now we're filtering just for those images. I'm going to select all those images, Command A or Control A on a Windows computer. And you see this little tool down here, this little painter, spray paint can, and you're going to choose the drop down next to it, the option called Settings. And that will allow you then to pick a preset. This is where I'm going to apply my black and white preset. Same principle applies for the black and white preset as does the color. I've designed it so that it works well across a variety of scenarios. And it actually largely mirrors the color preset as far as tonality is concerned. And that's really important because if you ever look at play with color presets and then run some black and white presets, you'll notice a difference in the way that contrast is handled. And so it's important to develop a preset that works consistently across the board and actually mirrors the color preset that you're using so you have a consistent look across the board. That's going to save you time. We are talking about scalability. If you're being paid $50,000 or $100,000 to go shoot a wedding and spend 100 hours processing your images, that's a whole different conversation. But I would venture to say that none of you are in that particular situation. So we want to create systems that are going to be scalable and efficient. And part of the way that we can do that is creating presets that work well across a variety of scenarios and look consistent with each other. So I'm going to choose that particular preset, and then wherever I want to, since I've already selected all these images, and I can click on any one of the images with the little paint can, and it's going to apply that black and white preset to the images. All right, so now I've got my black and white images. I'm going to undo that 5-star filter. I'm just going to click on the 5-star. We still have the flag clicked, so we are now looking at the images that we're going to give to our client. Now, if I photograph perfectly, I wouldn't have to actually go through and process these images. That's not the case. If you photograph perfectly, you wouldn't have to worry about post-production or outsourcing post-production, but that's probably not the case. So at this point, we're diving into the third step, which is the actual processing. And we're going to jump from the library module, the grid view, into the develop module. I'm going to click on the letter D, D for develop. And by the way, you'll notice, we'll pull these tabs back up. The library module, this is where we've been looking at these thumbnails. Develop module is the other module that we're going to use this evening. I'm not worried about map and book and slideshow and so forth. And really, probably the majority of you, for your workflow, whether you shoot weddings, portraits, maybe even do commercial, can get away with using these two modules, and that's really all you need to know. And what I'm teaching you this evening is probably going to cover about 90–95% of that. So let's jump to the develop module, letter D. This brings us into the develop module. Now you'll notice over on the right-hand side, we've got all these panels. If you've ever taken a workshop on Lightroom or Photoshop, you've potentially spent hours both learning and then trying to apply all the various techniques and learning what each one of those menu items represents and what it can do and what various options are represented by them. The less moving parts in your workflow, the more efficient it is and the less time you have to spend in it. That's really important to keep in mind. I personally would rather go spend time with my kids than sit in front of my computer, or go skydiving, or go play soccer, or whatever the case may be. I don't want to sit in front of my computer. So I want to figure out the fastest way I can get out from behind my computer. And if I'm not going to outsource my post-production, I need to be able to do it efficiently. That means the less moving parts in my workflow, the faster it goes. So I don't want to have to dive into all these panels down here, all these menu options. They're powerful, but the key here is that I've already built into my preset, my Lightroom preset that I applied at the beginning, or with the black and white just a second ago, I've already built all these settings into the preset if I want to apply them to these images. Now, the rare occasion, maybe 2-3% of the time, I might open up the HSL panel and adjust hue, saturation, luminance. I might go in and adjust the sharpening, or I'm sorry, not the sharpening, sharpening's under detail, but the profile, the lens profile. If I'm using a wide angle lens, I can adjust for distortion or chromatic aberration. And I can actually, by the way, save that into my preset too if I want to. But for the majority of my work, 95% of the time, the preset has already applied anything that matters down here, and I'm just going to focus on this basic adjustments panel. Now that's important for the reason I mentioned earlier, and that is minimizing the number of moving parts in your workflow for the sake of efficiency, for simplicity. It's also important though because it means that I can use keyboard shortcuts. I don't know if you guys know this, but you can actually cycle through the adjustments in the basic adjustments panel using keyboard keys. So the period or comma key allows me to cycle through these settings. You can see how I'm cycling up and down through that, the period or comma key. And then once I get to that particular setting, I can increase or decrease the setting using the plus or minus key. Or if I want to adjust in greater increments, shift plus or minus. So period or comma key to cycle up and down, plus or minus, or shift plus or minus to increase or decrease that particular setting. So once again, I'm able to use keyboard shortcuts. And again, keep in mind, if you take the time to take your hands off the keyboard, put it on the trackpad or the mouse or whatever device you might be using, drag that mouse down to the setting, click on the icon, drag that over one way or another, multiply that times hundreds or even thousands of images in a season, it's an incredible amount of time that you end up wasting. So, keyboard shortcuts. Cycle up and down through there, and then I can use the plus or minus keys to increase or decrease that setting. Very simple, okay? And then of course, if I'm moving from image to image, I've kept the film strip open down here so I can see what's coming up. That's going to be important here in just a second for copying settings, and I'll show you what I mean. But I can jump to that next image. Actually, before I do, I'll point out one more thing here. Actually, let me do it with a color image. And again, keep in mind, the color there does not reflect what I'm seeing on my screen. But there's a little tool. If I click on the letter J key, it activates the highlight or shadow clipping tool. And you can see up here in the histogram bar, these little boxes on the highlight and shadow end. If I have blown out highlight detail, excuse me, it's going to be represented with red. If there is lost shadow detail, you're going to notice blue patches in that image. So I can quickly check for lost highlight or shadow detail by just clicking on J to activate or deactivate that clipping tool. So in this case, I can come down here, of course, with my keyboard shortcuts, and well, first of all, we're going to drop exposure just slightly, but then I'm going to also bring down the highlights and bring that shadow detail back in. Or I'm sorry, the highlight detail back in. Now in this case, we're going to face one of really probably two occasions that we'll actually use the trackpad or use a mouse. And that is for straightening the image. This image is slightly crooked. I am going to use the keyboard key R, and again, don't ask me why the letter R, but R, to take us to the crop module. In this case, I guess it's applicable because we're going to rotate the image. But I'm just going to click over here on the corner. When I hold down the trackpad or the mouse, you'll notice that grid that's helpful and that allows me to help straighten or use the lines to match with lines in the image. And I can just click enter and apply that particular setting. Actually, that's a little too much there. Just a slight adjustment. That's good enough for now. But that is the one exception or one of two exceptions when I'm going to use the mouse. The other time that I might use a mouse, let's just say, for example, that I really jacked up the white balance in my image. And let's just hope I didn't shoot in JPEG. If I shot in JPEG, it's either black and white or trash, right? But in the case of this raw image, fortunately, we can adjust the white balance. But if I'm going to mess with the sliders, that's going to potentially take me a lot of time to try to dial that in. So I can do one of two things. I can use a keyboard shortcut, Command-Shift-U, that's auto white balance, and that'll at least give me a head start in the right direction. Command-Shift-U. The other way that I can go about trying to dial that white balance back in, and this is where we're going to use the trackpad or the mouse, is to use this little white balance dropper tool. I am going to use the letter W to activate it, but then I can click on, and actually let's bring that crazy white balance back. I can use the dropper tool to click on a neutral area in the image. And you can see a preview of this in the navigator window up here, what it's going to look like. It's kind of cool. But find a neutral area in that image, ideally a gray or a neutral gray. If you don't have gray, you can go to white or black. The other way to know if it's a neutral image or not, you'll see the RGB values down at the bottom of that grid. Ideally, you want to look for RGB values that are similar to each other. I just click on that neutral image and that gets me a head start. And then I can make slight adjustments from there. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? Okay, so we're going to continue to move on. Jump to this image. On my screen, that image looks okay, so I'm going to keep going. This is just slightly underexposed, so just a quick adjustment. Again, just using keyboard shortcuts, very quick adjustments. This image actually looks great. I'm going to keep it as is. Actually, you know what? We're going to bring the exposure down just a little bit, and we are going to make that adjustment and increase the temperature just slightly. Okay, now you'll notice down here on the bottom I've got a couple of images coming up. They were photographed in the same scenario, same lighting, same white balance. I don't want to waste time individually processing those images when I just did the work for this first image. So what I'm going to do is hold down the Shift key, move over with the arrow key to multi-select those images. And then I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut Command-Shift-S. Command-Shift-S, and it brings up that Synchronize Settings dialog box. And here I can choose the options that I want to synchronize from that reference image, the first image, across the rest. And I can deselect all or check all if I want to, or select individual options. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and synchronize all of them. I just hit Enter. And watch the thumbnails at the bottom. You'll see very quickly that they copy those settings. It was just a slight adjustment, so not anything too drastic, but it copies those settings across the rest of the images. If you were to want to copy settings from an individual image to another individual image, of course, you can use very similar shortcut, C rather. Brings up the same dialog box just to copy the settings. And then you can go and paste Command-Shift-V, V as in Victor, to paste those settings to another individual image. And then you know what, let's do this. I'll show you here in just a little bit how this works. So we already processed those images, so we don't have to do anything with them. Here's that image we looked at earlier. It is a little bit crooked, so I'm going to click on the letter R. We're going to straighten it using those lines. Just hit Enter. Jump to the next image, and similar scenario, right? Now here's another copy and paste tool. Option-Command-V. Keyboard shortcut Option-Command or Option-Control-V if you have a Windows computer. Option-Command-V, V as in Victor, to paste from previous. So it brings all the settings from the previous image, any processing you did with the previous image, it pastes to this image here. In this case, it was just a crop or a straightening, but if you made adjustments to contrast or brightness or otherwise, it'll bring those settings to this particular image. Option-Command-V. All right, so we'll start moving a little bit more quickly here. That one's fine. We're going to crop in. Just slightly, and actually let's bring this up so we can really focus on the interaction between the two of them. That's nice. We'll jump to the next image. This is a little bit underexposed, particularly in the eye, so I am going to bring exposure up. By the way, you'll notice, just for reference, we want to use the keyboard shortcuts as I showed you, but just for reference, I want to show you an histogram up here. Your exposure, you'll notice when I bring my mouse over the mid-tones, it lights up exposure. That's what exposure is making adjustments to. Then you can see the next segment over is shadows, and then blacks. Now you can actually make adjustments up here using the histogram if you want to just drag and drop. again, we want to use keyboard shortcuts for the sake of efficiency, but that option is there. Of course, you have highlights and then the whites over here as well. But that gives you an idea of what these sliders actually do. So we're going to increase the exposure just slightly, and I actually want to increase the shadows just slightly as well. I'll add a little bit of light to his eyes, and then we're going to move to the next image. Okay, slight crop here, bring that in just slightly to center, increase the exposure just slightly, move on to the next image. A little bit different crop, so we're just going to bring it in here from the left, like that, increase the exposure just slightly, on to the next image. Exposure just slightly. Those branches really frame them nicely, but I'm going to bring the focus into them just a little bit more. And on to the next image. And honestly, this image doesn't need a whole lot of work. We'll do this for the sake of demonstrating that that option to paste from previous. We'll bring in the crop just slightly. Bring that focus to the two of them, their interaction. We'll cut out his thumb that was sticking out there in the bottom. I love that. And we'll do the same thing here, just paste from previous. This couple actually, just side note, kind of a fun story. This is a couple that I worked with years and years ago. They hired us to shoot their wedding. They bought a $10,000 package. We're going to photograph their wedding in Chattanooga, where I live, in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And I get a phone call one day. The bride's on the phone, and she says, she's kind of hesitant. She says, so we were wondering if maybe you might consider going with us to St. Lucia to photograph our wedding. Of course, there's a slight pause, and then needless to say, I agreed wholeheartedly, but they actually eloped. There was some family drama, so they wanted to get out of that. They eloped to St. Lucia and took us with them to photograph their wedding, and it was just myself and my partner, and we had the island, well, the resort where they were staying, and the two of them. No family, no friends, and we got to photograph them for about 2.5 or day and a half, 2 days at this resort. It was absolutely incredible. And one of the things I loved about them too is that they're really into each other. So they had no problem being into each other in front of the camera, and it was just absolutely stunning. I had a really incredible time. But that was David and Krista, a really wonderful couple. All right, so we finished the actual processing. That was, and again, if there was no talking involved, then we've got, let's see, what is it, my math is not working, seven images. Yes, okay, 14, 17 images here. So that's roughly maybe 20%, 25% of the original number of images. If we're picking the best of the best, that's not too bad. On average, when I photograph an engagement session for clients, I was giving them about 30% of the original number of images. So we would shoot for a good bit, maybe for an hour to 2 hours, and then I might take them out for dinner. And but then I'd go back through and cull and process and give them maybe about 30% of the original number. So they're getting a very select few, and ideally the best of the best. That also means less processing for me. So the first step is the import with it, the develop preset, the Lightroom preset. We talked about that. That saves a lot of time later on because it's both applying that baseline finish to the images, but then it's also giving us, or doing the heavy lifting of those adjustment panels in the develop module. We are then culling and converting to black and white, and then we're actually into the processing itself, and you can see how quickly that can go. The focus is on that basic adjustment panel using keyboard shortcuts. You can move through these images very, very quickly. It's really important. We're up to the fourth step. It's the export process. You might say, well, yeah, that's a given. But I want to go ahead and share the export process with you because, again, there's a tendency that photographers have to kind of complicate things, and I want to share just a very simple workflow for you, and then we'll talk briefly about Lightroom catalogs. So in this case, we're going to select all, actually, you know what, for the sake of time, I'm just going to select 3 images so we can do a very quick export. But if you were to select all the images, the keyboard shortcut Command A to select all, or Control A if you're on a Windows computer. And then we're going to go to Command Shift E to bring up the export dialog box. Command Shift E for export. And this brings up the export dialog box. We've got a number of options here. First of all, we are going to export the JPEGs to that client folder that we looked at earlier. So we're going to choose go to the desktop, the external hard drive, to that client, and then we're going to create a new folder here. Actually, you know what? We'll highlight that client folder, click choose, and we'll just tell Lightroom to put it in a subfolder called edited. And then it'll drop that folder with the images into that client folder. Very simple. And then in some cases you may want to rename images. By the way, when we were talking about minimizing the potential issues with the Lightroom catalog, I recommend avoiding renaming files within the Lightroom catalog. If you're going to rename the files, rename on export. Keep the original file names intact just in case, for whatever reason, you get to a place where you disconnect the raw files from the catalog, and maybe when you go back to the original raw files, you don't have the renamed files, you're trying to connect them, Lightroom's not going to recognize them, and then you have a problem on your hands because you can't reference all your original work. There's all that work lost. So my suggestion to you is don't rename. Yes, in the catalog itself, if you click on F2, or F in F2, depending on how you have your keyboard set up, you can rename files within the Lightroom catalog. What I would suggest to you is that you wait until you go to export the images, and if you've manually reorganized images, or you sorted by maybe something other than capture time, you had to move your second shooter's images around, and you want to keep that order, certainly rename the images, but do that on export. And I'll show you a really simple way to do that. Right here, under file naming, I'm going to click rename. And I've created a renaming preset. I'm going to go ahead and create one here. We'll click edit. We've got a number of options in the drop down here, in the drop downs. In this case, we're going to keep it really, really simple. I'm going to start with a sequence number. And I surely hope that you don't need any more than a 3-digit sequence number. Your clients will thank you as well. We're going to click insert. And then I'm just going to throw an underscore in between. And then I do want to keep my original file name associated with this exported JPEG, because that means I can then reference the original raw file later on. That's really important. So I'm going to click insert for file name. So now what we have, you can see up here at the top, an example 001 underscore NAH. I don't know if Canon cameras do this now. I shot with Nikon, and the Nikon files you could actually customize the prefix. So my initials were in there. And when I used to photograph with my partner, we'd argue over who photographed what image, until we were able to rename the prefix on our images, and then there was no arguing who got the best image that day, so that was kind of fun. But I've got the prefix in there named, and then of course the image number itself. So sequence number underscore file name, and I can save that as a preset. In this case, I just saved the preset called Nathan. I'm going to click done. And now I've got the file naming set up. I'm going to start it with number 1, of course. File settings, JPEG and sRGB, that's pretty straightforward. And then quality setting, I'm going to recommend that you export at 80 quality. Be comparable to a level 10 in Photoshop. Now, the reason for this is that if you are uploading images to an online gallery, you're going to save an incredible amount of time in that upload process. You can cut as much as 1/3 of the file size from that JPEG file if you export at 80 quality. Now, I know you're going to ask, is it going to compress the image too much to get a large print? Absolutely not. The online gallery that I used to work with, I would export the images at 80 quality, upload to the online gallery, and they would compress those images to the nth degree to save space on their server. I then downloaded one of those images at one point, so it's been compressed in Lightroom, it's been compressed on their servers, and then I downloaded it and ordered a 20 by 30 and it printed beautifully. So no issue whatsoever exporting at 80 quality. You probably would even, and some photographers get really antsy about this stuff, and they'll zoom into 300% and analyze this thing to death. Even then you probably couldn't tell, and certainly your client's not going to be able to tell. But you're going to save some time in the upload process to your online gallery if you export at 80 quality. 240 ppi is standard protocol. I don't have to worry about sharpening because I've built that into my preset. Metadata, same thing. I can use a preset at the beginning. Watermarking, I'm not worried about. I'm going to go ahead and throw this in here. How many of you still use Photoshop to do some of your post-production work? Okay, it's certainly a really powerful tool. My recommendation to you is that you keep it or save it for retouching work. Lightroom is continuing to get better in the retouching arena. Not quite there yet, I don't think. But save the retouching work, or save Adobe Photoshop for retouching and do all the rest of the work in here. There's really no reason not to. But this little tool right here, or this little piece of the workflow can be really helpful. If you're still really stuck on a Photoshop action, that you've not been able to replicate in Lightroom? How many of you are familiar with Photoshop droplets? Anybody? It's kind of a hidden feature almost. It's almost like a mini application. Just do a quick search on YouTube, Photoshop droplets. But what it allows you to do is to create kind of a mini application, or a sub-application, if you will, in Photoshop, utilizing a particular Photoshop action. So for example, back when I used to blog images, or maybe put images on Facebook, I had created a blog action, you can see here, Photoshop droplet. And basically all it did was take the Photoshop action that was designed with a Kubota sharpening and some resizing and applying my watermark. And once it exports the JPEG images from this, it runs it through that Photoshop droplet, applies the Photoshop action, and drops it into a folder. Really, really convenient for automation and, again, saving time. Now, I personally wouldn't use Photoshop anymore, or even this process for processing my images. But if you are still stuck on Photoshop and there's a particular Photoshop action that you like to use, this is a way that you can use Photoshop but keep it efficient, automate that process. And you can plug that in right there. So you can tell it after export I wanted to run this particular Photoshop droplet, and you can set up that droplet to save to a particular folder, and you'll be set. And then I'm going to click export. And actually I'm going to turn that off for now. Click export. So we're just going to export a few images here for the sake of time. And you'll notice then in our client folder, we've got 3 folders now. We've got the originals, that's of course what we're processing. The Smith catalog, which we're going to talk about Lightroom catalog here in just a second. The edited folder, and this is where we're exporting those JPEG files. You'll notice the naming scheme, 001, and the file name, 2, and so forth. And then it's the export process. Any questions about the export process? Actually, any questions about the develop process? I didn't ask you after that step. We'll cover either one. No? Good, simple, easy. So the last thing I just want to point out, actually I'm going to point out 2 things here. One is, let's close up Lightroom for just a second so you can see this a little more clearly. So we've got 3 files, 3 files here in this particular folder called Smith Catalog. We've got the actual catalog file. I was chatting with somebody earlier about XMP files versus Lightroom catalog files. How many of you use XMP files right now, using Bridge or maybe even in Lightroom? Anybody? Okay, 1 person. Mindy, should I call you out? Mindy? No, Lightroom catalogs, the advantage to using the Lightroom catalog is that it's an individual file as opposed to having to manage individual XMP files for each and every image. There's a potential that you can lose that XMP file. You have to deal with the additional files when it comes to organization. So my recommendation to you would be to use the Lightroom catalog file. By the way, you can set that default. Actually, it is the default setting in Lightroom. You can turn off XMPs if you're currently utilizing them. But it keeps all of the data in this one tiny little file. You'll notice for that session that we processed, 2.4 meg. Tiny little database file. All the work that you did is housed in that one little catalog file. The culling, the processing, everything. Pretty powerful stuff. You also notice that you have the Smith catalog previews, and all this is right here, you don't actually need to keep the previews. That's simply where it built the thumbnails for the raw files. If you were to delete that file later and then come back to the job later on, all that would happen is it would have to rebuild the thumbnails. Just take a little bit of time. So that's not a big deal. And then we have the smart previews. Anybody know what smart previews are? Awesome, okay, I want to share this with you. And this is particularly applicable if you do work with a post-production company like Photographer's Edit, or maybe if you're giving your files to an in-house editor, they want to take with them on the road or take with them to their office, their house, or maybe you want to transfer some files to a laptop to take with you on a trip. Smart previews can come in really handy. And basically what they are is that they're miniature raw files. And they're about 1/10 the size of the raw files themselves. So for example, when we have photographers sending us files to process for them, if they're going to send us a 3,000 image wedding, let's say for example, that's a lot of data. It's probably 30 to 40, maybe even 50 gig, depending on what camera they're using. A lot of data. If they were to send us that same job using smart previews, it would be about 4 gig total. And it actually still allows you to have full processing capability, full raw processing capability in Lightroom, but at a fraction of the cost when it comes to time and data transfer. A really powerful tool. You remember we checked that option in the import dialog box, we checked that option off. So when we imported the images in, we actually generated smart previews. You can also do the same thing on export of the catalog if you want to. But if I wanted to go on the road with this particular session and process it elsewhere, and I didn't want to have to worry about all the raw files, all I would need would be these two files right here. In fact, I'll show you this. We're going to take this out. Let's get rid of the, we'll move the folder of raw files down here somewhere else. Move the whole folder, we didn't want to do that. Let's drag that back here. All right, let's move the originals out of this folder so that Lightroom gets confused. And I'm going to open this particular catalog. So all that we have to work with now are those smart previews. I double click on it, on the catalog itself. It is going to open the exception to that rule that I talked about earlier with the dialog box popping up and allowing you to choose a catalog. If you actually double click on an individual catalog, it will open that specific catalog. So what you'll notice now is that I can access these images, and I'm going to run the filter for there we go, flagged images. I see all the images here. If I want to, I can process the individual image itself. Show you here. Make adjustments to that if I want to, whatever I want to do. But it's working from the smart preview. The way that you know that is you've got this little square or rectangular icon right here, and if you keep your mouse over the top of it, it'll tell you that's a smart preview, or it's referencing a smart preview file. So you've got full processing capability. The only exception to processing with a smart preview is that once you are ready to export to JPEG, if you want to export a full-size JPEG, you do have to reconnect to the raw files. So do keep that in mind. But it's a really powerful tool, especially again, if you're working with a third-party processor, you can export just the catalog and the smart previews and save an extreme amount of time in the transfer process if you're transferring them online. Or if you want to minimize the amount of room that you're taking up on a hard drive and you're taking those images with you, you can do that using the smart previews, and it's a really powerful tool that way. Yes?
So talking about when you, like for instance, I accidentally renamed a folder, you know, like here's the folder I uploaded onto Lightroom, and then I forgot, and then I renamed this folder, and I went back later to adjust and it said I couldn't find it.
Yes.
Is there some kind of way to look like, is there some place to find what it originally was called, or what was the original connection?
You can certainly reconnect. Yeah, I'll show you how you can reconnect the files. If you rename the folder, that's going to be tricky. If you rename that folder outside of work in the catalog, then it probably won't be able to find that particular folder. You're going to have to find that. But what I will show you how you can do is to reconnect those catalog, or reconnect the raw files to the catalog. So what we're going to do in this case, we'll go ahead and bring the originals. Actually, you know what? Let's actually move the originals somewhere else. We're going to confuse Lightroom even more. And we'll move the originals in here. All right. So let's open up that catalog again. We'll even get rid of the smart previews. We'll throw it off even more. And previews. All right. So all we have is that catalog file. You move those raw files somewhere else. You open up that particular catalog that is associated with that shoot. What you're going to see in the library module, first of all, is that the folder of images that it would be referencing has a little question mark next to it. So at this point, you can do one of two things. You could right-click on that folder, that grayed out folder, and choose the option Find Missing Folder, and point Lightroom in the direction of that particular folder. So in this case, I would go to, I don't remember where I put it, Nathan Holritz, and then where do we go? Originals. I click Choose, and it would populate the images. The other way that you can do it in a bit more accurate way, less a chance that there is any issue in the Lightroom catalog, any confusion, is to click on the exclamation point. You can see if you roll your mouse over it, it says photo is missing. Click on that option and it says basically the same thing. Couldn't find it. Would you like to find it? Yes, of course. So I'm going to click on locate. And at this point, what I can do is point to an individual image. So I'm going to go to originals, and I'm going to point out the original image, that individual image, and then you'll notice an option down here that says find nearby missing photos. I'm going to leave that checked. and then click select. And it's going to be like, oh wow, I found it. And sure enough, all the images render or begin to render, and you'll be able to process them again. Because the folder's in a different location, it's showing a duplicate here, so you could actually get rid of the original. Just click remove. Because what it's now referencing is this folder of images. That's how you, does that answer your question? Did I understand your question? Did I just cover something absolutely unrelated?
No, you answered it right. I guess what I got trouble was I deleted them off my hard drive,
Okay.
the originals, but
Yes.
then I decided I wanted to, oops, I do want those back, so I pulled it off my hard drive and put it in, and I wasn't reading it. Like, I must have named the folder different. I trash them, so I don't have anything to go back and find.
I see,
I got
okay.
it saved on my, I've got a backup saved,
Yes.
but, so there's no way to repair. I thought maybe I could just, make that folder again and pull all those originals back in, and it would be like, oh, here it is.
Unfortunately, unfortunately Lightroom gets confused easily. And so this, I'm glad you said this, because this goes back to our original point, which is having a system in place. If you've got a system in place and you know every single time this is the folder tree that I'm going to create and the naming structure that I'm going to use, then there will never be an issue. And that's also why you don't want to rename the files in Lightroom, because again, there's potential confusion later on in trying to reconnect those raw files with the original catalog. So again, my suggestion to you is that you only rename on export to JPEG. You always keep the original name of the raw files intact so that the Lightroom catalog doesn't get confused. But great question and great point ultimately.
So does it get confused when you plug in the external hard drive? So like I save everything on my hard drive
Sure.
on my computer, so if I do it on an external, then I'm saving the catalog in there and I'm saving the folders, so
Yes.
then they're always tied together so they don't get confused?
Yeah, in that
Is
case,
that why, how it misses, like I'm like, what if I unplug it and plug it back in, it's not gonna get confused for that, or?
the way that you probably could have addressed the issue, if you did change or rename the folder, if you've got the original raw file names and they're still the same, the raw files, they're still named the same, then in that case, and you may potentially rename the folder, in that case what you're going to do is that second step that I showed you just a second ago, where you right click on that exclamation point next to the image and go find the image in the nearby photos, and that will help the catalog recognize that set of images again. Yes?
To add to that, or make sure this is correct, and it might not be. So, if you, the whole time you're working, you have it on your laptop or computer.
Yes.
And then you put it on the external hard drive later when you're done. And
Yes.
you're not gonna probably touch it again, or maybe not for a long time. You need to move that over so that Lightroom catalog is over there after that?
Yeah, and that's a great question because it kind of expounds on what we were talking about. So, no, actually, because you're keeping that folder together with the files and the Lightroom catalog, you're not going to have to move anything. All you have to do is double click. Actually, the only exception to that, if you did move that folder of images to your desktop to process, in that case, you are going to have to tell Lightroom specifically that you're working from the external hard drive. And all you do is go through that process that I just walked you through, where you point the catalog to the specific folder or to the specific image, and it will recognize it immediately. But if you're working from the external hard drive the whole time, there won't be any issue. All you have to do is open up the catalog and it'll recognize it immediately.
As long as, if you did move it, as long as you move that whole original folder with everything inside.
Yes.
It will be there.
Yes, ma'am. The other thing to keep, that I recommend to you, and of course it's obvious when you look at the workflow here, but when you import your images or download your cards to your desktop, only download them to one folder. If you're working with multiple folders, well, it makes more work for you. There's more organization for you, certainly, but it can also potentially confuse the Lightroom catalog. There's a lot less potential for confusion. I don't want to say corruption because it's not actually corruption, but the Lightroom catalog can get confused. If you're working with multiple folders and you shift one of the folders or you rename it, put everything into one folder before you import that folder into Lightroom. And that's the simplest, least confusing, and certainly the workflow with the least potential problem if you keep it in one folder and import it that way. So I highly recommend that. This very workflow that we showed you here, if you stick with it, I'll move this originals back in just so you can see it for the sake of example. Take these originals and bring them back in. This simple file organizational system, and then of course the workflow itself, if you stick by it, you're gonna get a lot of work done really, really quickly. And ultimately that means more time for you. and time for your family, and time for your friends, and time for those things that ultimately matter in the long run. So if you've got any further questions, I'm certainly glad to answer those now, or you're welcome to come chat with me afterwards. I'm going to send a follow-up email to you all. Just one email. You're not going to get spammed by Photographer's Edit. Just one email that will have the downloadable PDF for the keyboard shortcuts. I am going to go ahead and throw a 20% discount in there. If you guys want to try Photographer's Edit, you're welcome to do that. First time, 20% discount. And a link to our newsletter if you do want to get future emails. But just one email, look out for that because it will have that the download link for the PDF of the keyboard shortcuts. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
All right, we do what you said where we do the proofs. We then do in-person sales, sell them. I then take them into Photoshop and edit them.
Okay.
So let's say they order 10 poses, so I edit those 10 poses a lot of times and we make them a sticky album or something where we
Okay.
downsize it.
Sure.
So what I try to do then is take those edited images back into Lightroom just to do a quick downsize,
Okay.
and it won't read them. If
Okay.
I'm working off the same Lightroom off the same computer.
This is a
And
great.
and it's so annoying because I have to go to another computer and load them onto another Lightroom.
Sure, sure. This is a great point. Did you all hear that pretty well? Okay, simple version. She's going to take the images that she processed in Lightroom, a selection of them, and take them into Photoshop and process them. But you're saying that once you try to bring them back into Lightroom, that they're or
Well,
reconnect
we're not
into
working
Lightroom?
off, we're not like working in the Lightroom catalog
Okay.
right there anymore. What we'll do is we'll make a separate folder of the images that they ordered,
Yes.
and then take those into Photoshop, edit them, that kind of thing, and then we take that folder, try to bring that into Photoshop.
I see.
And it won't read them.
Okay, so what I'm going to recommend to you is a really simple workflow. If you are going to take images in, certainly retouch those images in Photoshop, how you can keep everything organized still within Lightroom simultaneously. I'm going to show that to you here. Let me just reconnect this catalog. Since we moved that folder, we're going to get rid of it. There we go. All right, so let's take, I love the interaction here, this image. Let's take this image. Actually, you know what, let's jump back to the library module. So we mentioned earlier that the images that we mark with the P key, we'll go ahead and run a filter for them, are the images that we're going to give to the client. You see those all here. By the way, that rendering, that's what I talked about earlier. That's what happens if you import with minimal preview. But we've got these images here that we're giving to the client as proofs, or that maybe in her case, what's your name, I'm sorry?
Melissa.
Melissa is showing to her clients as proofs. But then just a select few of those images are going to actually be processed to give to them as prints or otherwise. So in that case, let's pick a different, we'll give it a color label. This is actually what I did for my, again, back in the days when blogging was a little bit more popular than Facebook. When I used to blog images, I would give the images, the select images, a red flag, or flag them red. So in this case, we're going to mark them with number 6. We'll give them a red flag. And of course, you can do this any number of ways, any color or otherwise, but we'll do it with a couple of them. What I'm going to say, now we can leave it at this right here, and we just know that our red labeled images are those images that we're going to further process or retouch in Photoshop and give to our clients. We can take it one step further if you want a little bit more organization and separation. It's a really cool feature called collections. Let's actually open this up right here. You can see collections, and what I'm going to do is actually create well, in this case, they've already created a smart collection. We can call it colored red, or I might create a colored or a smart collection that pulls up, you know, let's say I gave it a 1-star rating to all my images that I'm going to retouch and give to the client. I can create a smart collection that will automatically pull those 1-star images into a collection. Keep in mind, this is a virtual collection, and this is the cool thing about it. It's only, that information is only, that organization is only housed within the catalog. So it's not creating an additional folder on your hard drive or on your server. It's simply creating some virtual organization. In this case, we already have a smart collection called Colored Red. So I've got the images that I'm going to process for my client here. So we've narrowed it down even further. I haven't had to go outside the Lightroom catalog at all. I haven't had to create any duplicate images or duplicate folders or additional folders. Now I'm going to open this particular image here in Photoshop. So Command E is the keyboard shortcut that I'm going to use to open it in Photoshop. And for the sake of example here, just for fun, because of course we want to have fun, what I'm going to do is just make a drastic adjustment here so you know that we've adjusted the image. And then I'm just going to click Save, or the keyboard shortcut is Command S. And we'll minimize Photoshop here. What's going to happen is that that image that you worked on in Photoshop gets saved right next to the original in Lightroom. Now this is great again because we don't have to create additional files or additional folders, and all of our organization stays within Photoshop, or I'm sorry, within Lightroom. You're not having to worry about reconnecting those files or re-importing them or finding where they are. The whole workflow stays here. And of course, anything that you do in Photoshop will get saved. By the way, just a side note, in case you all don't know, you do have the option in your preferences. By the way, the keyboard shortcut I use for preferences, Command, comma. Preferences, external editing tab, you do have the option to be able to choose TIFF or PSD as your default file type when you're processing in Photoshop. So you can adjust that there. But what it does is...
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Because I'm following this, but when I am editing tons of wedding images and I do this, I'm like, oh, I love that one, that's going into Photoshop and do something special to it kind of thing. It will save it at the whole end of my whole lineup, but I want to stay in that one. In like stuff I'm doing like a bunch outside, but it'll save it at the end of my reception at the end of the night. It's so annoying. I wanted to save it in that pile that's already, does that make sense?
Or right next to it, are you
Yes,
creating...
right next to it where it was, but it'll save both of them at the end of the whole pile.
You know, of course, you do want to make sure that it's sorted by capture time or even file name, if that's how you prefer. Do you all remember, does anybody remember where that setting is that tells it to put the file right next to it? I've totally forgotten where that is. Anybody? No? Let's see, it might actually give you, here we go, right here it says stack with the original.
Stack with the original?
Yep, so that option you want to make sure that you have that clicked.
Okay.
And that should just...
Preferences
under external editing.
Okay, okay, thank you.
And as much work as you're probably doing with layers and so forth, I would go ahead and, while you're in that preference, choose PSD and save it as a PSD. So you maintain that as well.
Thank you.
Sure. So again, for the sake of simplicity and organization, try to do as much as you can in Lightroom. If you have to take it outside Photoshop, you can still save all of that, keep it organized within your Lightroom catalog, and it's pretty powerful that way. Yes?
I have one. I lose a ton of time culling when I have multiple cameras that aren't time synced.
Yes.
If I forget to time sync them, that's terrible. So what's your solution for that when you're going through and they're not matching at all?
Yeah. Let's see if I can remember how to do that. It's been a little while. Let me go back. I'm going to actually undo this. We'll take this file out. Just delete that. All right, let's actually pull. I think I have a set of demo files that we can pull to demonstrate this with. Let me see if I can find those really quickly. And this is totally off the cuff. I'm gonna be upfront with you guys. I haven't played with the time sync process in a little while, so we'll see if I can remember how to do it. There we go, yeah, this is good, okay. So this is a random, my poor son, he was, let's see, 2008, he would have been 6 years old, I guess. He was a model for me for many test images. This was a random test image I think I was doing to create presets or something at the time. We'll go ahead and pull this into the demo catalog. See if I can remember how to do this. All right. Okay. So what you're going to notice, actually here, we're in the library module, is that you can come right down here to capture time. And there are a couple of ways you can do this, but you can come down here to capture time, and you can actually adjust the capture time here. Now, you'll notice it doesn't give an option to synchronize settings here, so what you actually want to do then is select all the files in this case. And by the way, you can run a filter for, under metadata, you can run a filter for various cameras. On the filter bar there in the library modules, I can actually see this one was shot with the Nikon D2X, this one was shot with the 40D. But I'm going to select all those images and then go to capture time. And then I can actually select, well, I can select all the images to shift by a certain amount of time. Now in this case, what I can do is I can look at the individual image. So you can see this one was shot on June 3rd, 2008 at 3:05:59. And in this case, this one was shot at June 3rd, 2008 at 4:05. So what is that? 3 minutes and 21 seconds. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that as a reference. I'm going to run a filter for one of the cameras, whatever the camera might be. So in this case, we'll just say we're going to run a filter for all the files shot with the Canon that I know are 3 minutes and 21 seconds off. Select all those images, and I'm going to click on this little option right here, adjust to a specified date and time. Of course, it shows the original. I'm going to make the adjustment to the corrected time and click change. And it will update, based on that calculation and the adjustment, it will update all those files to then synchronize with the files from the other camera. Does that make sense? It's a little bit of a process. The key is finding the difference. Just pick any image that was photographed at the same or roughly the same time. So you're going to look for something like the kiss or the toast, or maybe they're feeding each other the cake. Photographed from 2 different angles probably. But if they were photographed at that same, roughly that same second, you can use those as references. Look at the time, the capture time for each of them. Do the math to find the difference. And then run a filter, as you see right here, for one camera or the other. Select all those files and shift the time using that tool that I just showed you.
Does it still work if they're the same bodies?
Say that again?
Can you sort it by like a camera serial number?
You can actually, yeah, it's pretty cool. So I'm just going to click on this, I'm sorry, not that, right here, this little drop down. And the option right underneath it is camera serial number, so you can sort by camera serial number. Yeah, the filtering tools in Lightroom are extremely powerful. Give you a lot of flexibility, a lot of control, a lot of organizational ability. And of course you can create smart, if you want to from the get-go, you could actually create a smart collection that would filter for those various cameras and separate them that way as well. Really easy to do. Any other questions? Comments, ideas? Yes, ma'am.
I was going to ask if you could quick show the airbrush can black and white thing you did earlier.
That process? Sure. Let me jump back. Actually, you know what? We'll just use these images here. So I'm going to select those images, and then right down here, this little tool, get rid of right down here at the very bottom, and I think you can activate or deactivate that, yeah, using the letter T for toolbar. Put this toolbar down here, that's where the paint can is. You're just going to click on that, and then there's a drop down with various options. You're going to choose settings, and then you can choose whatever preset that you'd like to apply to the images. Once you've done that, then you can come up here, make sure that you selected all the images you're going to apply that to, Command A, and then you can click on any one of the images and it will apply it to all the images in that group. Yes?
What's the benefit in setting a flag for an image like you do when you're sorting versus like I do a collection? So I have my automatic lane going through my photos, my caps lock on, and then I'm either selecting it for a quick collection or I'm passing right by it.
Yeah.
And that's how I home, I'm able to go through things quickly. Is there an advantage to doing the flag over that method?
There's not.
Okay.
There's not yet. I mean, that's a great way to do it. So what she's talking about is creating or referencing these images as part of a quick collection. You can use the keyboard key, the letter B, and it will add these images to a quick collection, and that's actually a really quick way to do it as well. And the one advantage, actually, in fact, to doing it that way is that it automatically adds it to a folder that you can reference very quickly.
And I do the same thing with my blog, just if I'm going through.
Sure.
While I'm culling, I give it a 5-star.
Yeah.
So I know automatically that's my blog image. So I
And you can run a filter for that, or yeah, or you can run a collection for it, that's right.
Yeah, and then when I'm all done, I just export those to the blog. So
Yes. Yeah, that's a really efficient way to go about it, that's great. Yes?
I'm diehard Photoshop lover. I started in Photoshop. My
Sure.
husband bought me my room and I literally let it sit there for a year before I finally loaded it on my computer.
I hear you, yeah.
Why on God's green earth is there not an opacity slider for preset? I bought some presets because that's what people told me the cool kids were doing,
Okay,
and they're really harsh.
yes.
And it's just like, why? Why can I not turn the opacity down?
And I wish there was, but I'll show you the alternative, and you may have figured this out. Have you figured out how to update the preset? Or modify it for yourself?
Yeah, but I didn't save it. I don't know.
Okay, I'll just, even if you know how to do this, I'll show everybody how to do this very quickly, because this is particularly helpful. We were talking about creating a preset that works. You gotta love that expression. Creating a preset that works, it's important that you are able to update a preset, customize it to work for you. So let's just say, for example, and by the way, don't ever create a preset that includes exposure as part of that preset, because if you've already photographed that image well to begin with, you don't want to then adjust the exposure. So don't save exposure. And side note, also don't save auto settings into that preset. Because again, the computer can override really great work that you did in the camera, and then you're out more time going back and making adjustments. So don't do that. But let's make a couple of adjustments let's add some clarity, and we'll add some saturation back in. And then what we're going to do, let's just say that this is a preset. We'll say that this is the PE black and white preset. I'm just going to control click or right click on that particular preset and choose update with current settings. What it will do is bring up a dialog box. And this is where it gets a little bit technical. As I just pointed out, don't choose the auto tone option. And in fact, what's best to do is just go ahead and click none. Make sure that you're very specifically choosing the options that you want saved for that preset. You are going to have to go through and look. You probably have to do some before-afters, applying that preset and then scanning through and looking at all the adjustments in the various panels to see what that preset is adjusting, because some of them are actually very, very detailed, very technical. Make sure you understand what settings are being adjusted by that preset, but you can tone those down and then click on that preset or right-click on that preset. Click update with current settings, make sure that the appropriate settings have been checked, and then click update, and you'll have an updated preset that actually that works for you the way you would want it to versus the way it was originally designed. And I highly agree with you. I still remember, and I started shooting in 2001, so I actually started out in film, but then transitioned into digital. And I remember this was about 2003, 2004, something like that. But at the time, one of the most popular things, kind of like film presets are really popular right now, at the time there was something called a Lomo preset. You guys know the Lomo cameras that kind of generate this funky vignette around the images? And photographers, including myself, were applying this Lomo preset to images. And of course, within 2 or 3 years, that fad was gone, and I'm pulling up a sample album that I actually created with images using this particular, it was a Photoshop action. Or some type of a software that applied this look, and it looked absolutely terrible. So I'm with you that a lot of these presets are kind of over the top. Certainly tone them down. You want to generate an image that's classic, that's going to look good in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years when your client opens up that album. So I'm with you on toning the presets down a little bit at least. Any other questions, ideas, comments, suggestions? Yes?
You activated your filters with what key?
Say that again?
Filter.
Oh, the filters. Command L. And of course, that's in the library module itself, but Command L will activate or deactivate.
Or even the top. I lost the top at one point, and I don't know how I got it back. It's like,
you know what? I did that
shot with 2 different cameras.
Yeah, I did that just the other day, and I'm trying to remember actually what key it was. Is it I? Do you guys remember? You all remember? I don't think it is. By default, it'll actually come down that way, and I think. Now I can't remember the keyboard shortcut either. Yeah, that happened to me the other day, and I was like, wow, where did that thing go? Same thing happened with the toolbar down here. And of course, that can be fixed with the letter T. And I think there's a quick keyboard shortcut for the filter, but by default, that filter bar is there, and you can activate and deactivate it with Command L as the keyboard shortcut. All right. Any other questions? If you guys have any questions about post-production, Photographers Edit, I'm glad to help you. We do offer custom post-production for wedding and portrait photographers, and that's kind of what sets us apart from the rest, is that we're actually creating a custom profile that matches your processing style. But I'm glad to answer those questions later on, and of course via email as well. But thank you so much for letting me come share with you.
Good job, man. What a lot of information. Thanks for coming. We have a ton of guac and salsa. Help yourself. Hang out. Use Photographers Edit. Will save you a lot of time. And check out Coloring Products, Uniprints Products, and have a good night. Oh, next month we have Thinking Carrie Ann Miranda. She's a family photographer from the Bay Area. You'll get an email. It'll be same place, same time, on a Tuesday. I'll be here. It's all good. Cool. Thanks for coming, y'all.
Thank you.
Bye. Texas.